I'm joined today by my brilliant colleague, Janine Gibson, the only person I've worked with who has their own listing on IMDb. She's had a fantastic career, but I think most famously, she was, as US editor, in charge of the Guardian team, which delivered the Snowden revelations, which won the Guardian the Pulitzer Prize. She went on to be deputy editor of the Guardian, editor of BuzzFeed UK, and is now assistant editor at the FT, where she's in charge of our digital newsroom strategy. So thanks for joining us, Janine. I think people are going to want me to ask you a little bit about the Snowden affair just before we go on to other things. So, I mean, just tell us about how that story came to you and what your emotions were like as you went through it.
Well, the first I heard of it was a phone call from Glenn Greenwald, who at the time was slightly less controversial than he is now. I imagine that's hard to imagine, but he rang me up and said, I've got the biggest security leak in a generation. I've got the biggest story that you can possibly imagine. I've got the biggest security leak in a generation. And I had worked on the WikiLeaks story back in London for The Guardian when that had happened. I hadn't led it, but I've been working near enough to it to know that phone calls and talking about secret and sensitive information on phone calls is probably something you think twice about. Plus, I knew that Glenn only had a Skype phone at his idyllic retreat in Rio where he lived. And I'm talking to him on my cell phone and thinking, Glenn, are you talking to me on Skype? I knew that Skype was not the most secure thing in the world. And he said, yes, I'm at home. I'm calling you on the Skype phone. I'm like, right, okay, well, this may or may not be the biggest security leak in a generation. We'll get to that. But for a start, should we just end this call? Shall we end this call now? At that point, I think Glenn hadn't actually read the documents, because he would have realised that perhaps the Skype call wasn't the way to talk to the editor about it. But we put him on a plane. He came to New York, and we met with him and Laura Poitras, who made a documentary detailing her relationship with Snowden and the story. We sat there in my office, and we had this tiny office. We'd only just started up in New York. I had this sofa that was, very luxurious IKEA, very, very inauspicious piece of furniture, on which we all crowded together, bent over this dreadful Dell laptop, because we had to buy an air-gap computer to look at the thumb drive. So the world's cheapest laptop, the world's cheapest sofa, all these journalists crammed on a sofa looking at these slides that looked like, I don't know if you remember the Prism presentation, which kicked it all off. That was the taster that we had. And these slides look like they've been made by a 5-year-old in Photoshop. They're really clumsy, rubbish slides with terrible graphics. And so I was sitting at this, pressing these clunky keys on this dreadful, going, it could be real, or it could be a really bad fake. And there was no real way of knowing other than to report it out. So from then, that's from that point on.
Was there
my first question? I immediately employed Ewan McCaskill, who you may know, who's the Guardian's long-term, he's the long-term trouble guy, really. He's basically our Harvey Keitel. If anything was kicking off, he'd just send Ewan in, because he was unflappable and done every job. Happened to be in New York at the time. So I sort of deployed Ewan. We sent them off to Hong Kong to go and meet Snowden, who we didn't know who he was at all, and we built up this picture of him as being this sort of late career NSA guy, probably with some sort of incurable disease and an attack of conscience. It was a very filmic scenario we had built up. They were not expecting to find some 26-year-old but well thought out plan. Anyway, we sent him off with a list of sort of 40 ways in which he could disprove the veracity of these documents. Our starting point was always Hitler diaries. This is a massive hoax, and we are the naive new players in town, and we are being strung along. So, and at every one, he just kept producing evidence that it was real. You never really have time to get excited. I think we turned the first one around in 3 weeks, and then the whole time there was so much work to do. You just sort of really focus on, okay, head down, let's just get through each step of this, and
it's always that
get the stories out.
It's always that question in your head about what's the one thing I've forgotten to ask? What's the one thing I missed here?
Right. what is the obvious gimme that this is all made up? We were like, right, well, if you work for the CIA, he must have some idea. Look for a car parking pass, ask him for, we were really trying to knock it down.
So let's talk about investigative journalism more generally, because you also oversee the investigative team at the FT. I think they report into you. And do you think there's a difference? What are the differences in pursuing stories that are essentially financial, in following the money and going on and reporting on businesses in particular, as opposed to politics or security? Are there differences in the way you have to go about it and what you need in your armoury?
Well, look, you know more about this than me, and I am very much still learning the differences after I've been at the FT 2 years now. But one of the things I realised very, very early on is that the legal framework in which you operate is different. And I'm sort of accustomed to the working of a big story where the lawyers are sort of so much, it's not something where you produce your copy at the eve of publication and then you get it legal. The lawyers are involved. The lawyers are involved from conception through every single step. Before you make a phone call, you want to talk to a lawyer about it. And we've had some of those conversations on non-financial stories, but I can remember the first meeting at the FT where I realised that there was a whole other legal framework around business stories that I hadn't even conceived of. So that was very interesting.
One of the things, isn't it, is that almost anybody we write about has the resources to sort of sue us to hell. So you always have that fact in the back of your head.
Right. And I think political investigations, even involving terrifying foreign superpowers, in the end, you've always got the lever of informing the public and the fact that publishing is really going to be your saviour. That once everything hits the light of day, you're having that debate in the open air, and that's a release valve. Whereas at the FT on a financial investigation, you would definitely be extremely nervous at the moment where it hits the light of day, because that's when it's all going to kick off.
I think one of the things that I was been very struck by in the last few years is that some of the sort of the dirty tricks that the people you are investigating throw back at you, which you sort of associate with, very furtive security regimes. Actually, this is being employed by companies now. So when we did our Wirecard investigation, which I don't know, went on for 2 or maybe 2.5 years, and we were on the back foot although we were publishing, we were under the cosh for a lot of that time, under attack from German authorities and the company. I mean, some of the dirty tricks that are being employed by these companies, and not just the FT, but other news organizations as well, are quite shocking these days.
Right. So we had all of this when we were doing Snowden. And the weird thing about doing Snowden, that story, was the sort of manual of the things that people were doing to try and stop you reporting the story was part of the story. We had all their we knew what their tactics were because we had the documents that showed us, and both the sort of technical capacities that they had, but also the psychological warfare that they run against people they want to put pressure on. Then at BuzzFeed, when Heidi's team were doing the Russia stories, the mysterious deaths in London happening on British soil, I saw those things being deployed against journalists who work for us, and we were very, very sensitive to the various surveillance and frightening
about the kind of things you were doing to sort of protect the journalists and BuzzFeed.
What we did, I mean, the first thing you do is sort of protect everyone's devices, and you do a whole bunch of take a whole bunch of measures that we won't talk about there, but everybody moves to very secure comms, which is a hell of a lot easier now than it was 7 years ago because of Snowden. Things like Signal that we can use routinely, like WhatsApp, those weren't available. Secure messaging and encrypted messaging was almost impossible then. Then the other thing you have to do is have some sort of security for the journalists involved, particularly if you're writing about, unexplained deaths on British soil. There are obvious security concerns for people. And then as an editor, I think the most thing you mostly have to do is say to reporters who like to pretend that they are scared of nothing, it's okay to be a bit paranoid. Yes. I know people will say tin hats, but it's okay. If you walk into your house and you think, I'm sure someone's been in here, you can call me up and tell me that, and I will believe you, because that's it's not inconceivable.
And the other thing I think that's very, I can't remember which story it was, but it was in the US, maybe it was New York Times, was the sort of entrapment processes that seem to go on, where people are offering fake stories to journalists and calling them to meetings so they can record them and see if they can get them to say something that they would regret. I mean, it's quite shocking now.
We had one of those, and again, we were very clear-eyed about it, so we were pretty sure it was a catfishing exercise. But I'm not going to talk about any of the details, but suffice it to say, if you're approached by somebody very, very beautiful on Facebook who wants to tell you chapter and verse on a story that sounds really very sexy, then that's alarm bells.
Yeah. Although one day we'll miss a great story that way, but I suppose. But
although you have to work it, you just have to be really careful.
Let's talk about digital journalism. I mean, you and I first met, I don't know how many years ago, in a debate about pay models. And the world has moved on so much.
You love to bring that up because you were right.
Well, I think we were both right in our way.
Guardian's still going.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I was going to say. That when you look at the economics of digital journalism now, it's striking how hard it is for any large organisation to keep funding itself and do the journalism. The kind of journalism we've just been talking about, incredibly expensive. You need some kind of defence fund to look after yourself. I just wonder, when you look at the economics of journalism now, how do you see it affecting the business itself, and how do you see us moving forward? I mean, is it all essentially sugar daddies or subscription models now for any large organisation?
Well, no, I mean, I do think that when we had that debate 100 million years ago, we ended up concluding very boringly that a mixed economy was probably, there were many models, and a mixed economy was probably ideal. And I still think that, and I think, there is clearly room for a trust model. There's clearly room for a philanthropic model. There's clearly room for a paywall model, but the paywalls necessarily mean either great scale or very, very, very expensive, and that brings its own concerns about democracy of information. I think each one of them, there's no ideal. They all have their own pressures and potential problems. We're all very aware of the problems of being owned by an oligarch or a Murdoch or whatever, and the potential biases there. But being the Barcelona Football Club Guardian membership model also has its own issues. You get a lot of pressure on your editorial line from subscribers / members who feel they have a say. Or
I mean, I was going to say, we've seen this, haven't we, in the New York, most obviously, I think, in the New York Times, where having bolstered their subscription so heavily on we are the anti-Trump vehicle, the moment they're tempted to be even-handed in any way, or just not as anti-Trump, they face a membership revolt, and that's it drives the polarizations. I just wonder if that makes it hard for organizations to be more even-handed, if you have to have an angle to have a subscription model.
I think it makes it really hard to over-depend on any one form of revenue, don't you? Because it happened to the Guardian with Corbyn. They couldn't do right for, they couldn't be pro-Corbyn enough for their audience, and yet there was a whole other swathe of audience that was very sceptical.
And we feel this pressure on Brexit. We felt it the same way a little bit, I think. So it is unnerving, and I mean, maybe it does lead itself to smaller, nimbler organisations which don't attempt to cover the whole waterfront, but just say we're going to focus in on this. We've got a dozen journalists or whatever it is, and some kind of franchising model, and we're not in it to make vast sums of money. We're just in it to pay our bills.
Well, there's two things there, isn't there? One is, how do organisations that are very captured by a loyal subscriber base and news organisations necessarily work to best to a good, strong demographic? How do they broaden out and future-proof themselves whilst not alienating and pissing off their core demographic? But also, the cyclical nature of media means that as things close down into three great big monoliths that seem to be all of the news organisation, there's always little things that spring up and might catch fire and might get. But we're at the end of a cycle right now where your BuzzFeeds, Vices, they're all having issues, but there'll be a next generation that comes up behind.
Absolutely, and they also changed the way we do journalism. So
it's all terribly good. Young people come along and they'll be all innovative and change everything. And
what about the battle? I mean, one of the questions I still struggle on is the balance between living on social media and actually being a destination in itself. And I remember when Quartz was formed. I did this job long enough to remember when Quartz abolished the homepage, and I was still there when they reinvented it. Actually, how important do you think hubs really are? I can see they have a role if you're charging people a subscription, a substantial one, but I wonder the extent to which you can survive entirely on a social media model.
Well, as you know, I'm currently engaged in redesigning a homepage. I can't believe I'm doing this again for the 18th time in my career, when I have also been present at the abandoning of them. I do. Boringly, it's both. You can grow a long way. You can make a lot of noise and grow a big following and a big audience without a home destination. And we see that in the rise of the individual and the Substack and the influencer and the people that don't really write long pieces, just have an audience from social. But I think in the end, if you want to build a substantial business and to cover any breadth, i.e. be what we would term a news organization as opposed to an individual, then you do need a home base. You need a home. You need an archive. You need a library so that people can have a wander around. You need to be able to say, if you like that, you like this. You do need something.
And I think let's go back to investigating. If you were setting up an investigating hub, or something like Shomrim, a BIJ, whatever it is, what would you say are the sort of the core skills I need in my core team? What kind of people do I need?
I'm a big fan of identifying the skills that you want, and then not being too prescriptive about the people, because people have a vast array of skills now, and they're not trained in the same way. Really, yeah. So obviously you've got to have you've got to have somebody who is as good at security as is possible. You need somebody who's a massive obsessive and tracks everything. I'm currently obsessed with the guy that runs Signal, and his sheer insouciance in his arms race with the security service is just my favorite thing. I'd love to hire him, wouldn't you? He's probably out of our league. But you need somebody with that sort of approach, and that feel for it and that love of it, which is much closer to gamifying than it is to journalism, because it's about always staying ahead and being on the move. And I think in the old days you needed somebody who was a bit smooth and personable and could talk their way in. And these days I'd rather have someone who can work out where the exits are and the code, basically, and the exploits. You then need somebody who loves numbers. You still need somebody who knows how to string a sentence together, and weave a proper narrative, or else everybody goes far too dense and dark and can't be reached by anyone else. And you need somebody you really need somebody who's quite good at getting their shoulder through the door. There's sort of death knock skills, if that's not too terrible way of putting it. But in the old days, as a reporter, you'd had to do your time on the locals and work out how to go and sit down with someone who's having the worst day of their lives and somehow get a photograph for the paper. And these days, I think we really squirm at that idea, and younger journalists find that really appalling. But at some point, we did a story at BuzzFeed that was about identifying one of the Beatles, the jihadi Brits who had gone over and were executing people, and one of our journalists had to be the person to go to a council estate in Shepherd's Bush and get in the room of the parents. That's not nothing. That's a big deal. But if you get that interview, then that tells a lot more of the story than the tracking together.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Okay, last question. We talk a lot about post-truth and the war on journalism and the war on facts. Are there things that media organizations should be doing that maybe they're not doing enough of yet to counter what essentially is partisan news and the ability for people to say, I don't like your news, I'm going to take that news over there, which is more convenient to my belief system? Are there ways we can proof ourselves a bit more?
Why don't you say an easy one? Look, there are technical things.
If I knew the answers, I'd be interviewing myself, wouldn't I?
If there are technical things we can do that we are doing in consort with other news organisations. We're working on watermarks. We're working on ways to stop the very adept spoofing of all of our attempts to brand our news, which are really good now. They're very, very sophisticated. So we can do a bit of that. But again, that only helps people who want to look for verification and assurances. What you're sort of getting at is people who want to seek out who actively want to seek out confirmation of their own biases, and that I don't know that a news organisation can do that. I think that might be an education issue rather than a media issue. And I think in the UK, that's a really big problem for the BBC, because they do seem to be burdened with both aspects of that. I'm not sure a news organisation can reach into the mind of somebody who wants to be elsewhere. I've never really understood that how the FT can beat QAnon. That doesn't really work.
I think the only thing we can do is, which is related but not the same, is make sure we're always checking our own biases and our own groupthink, and the extent to which we all just confirm our own opinions within an organisation rather than making sure we're reaching out and challenging ourselves. It's a different
point. Of course, absolutely.
It's
a really good point. And of course, all the stuff and I think the industry has come a million miles in the last 10 years on transparency and displaying sources and linking to sources and being open about when we've got stuff wrong and correcting it in plain sight. All that stuff is great. But in the end, it's only a piece of the puzzle.
That's so much. Thanks so much for your time, Janine. It's been
nice
great
to talk to you,
about
Robert. We should go back to the office.
We should actually meet in the office someday soon.
Yeah.